Hi, and welcome back to Gender Studies. Now, this may not be needed to be stated. However, you may have noticed that your textbook has a significant American view. Now, remember, much of what occurs in the U.S. has also occurred to some degree in Canada and around the world. So please view much of what you're hearing and reading for this course that it does apply in Canada. Now, there have been three waves to the women's movement. Society shapes how we understand femininity and masculinity, and we are in turn shaping society's view of gender through the way we communicate. Now, this has important implications for the rights and roles we are allowed and expect for men and women. Now, we're going to look at each of the three waves and the philosophies within each. The first wave, 1840 to 1925, and the main focus here was status and rights of women. The second wave, around 1963 and to about the mid-90s. And here they had much more diverse goals: equity, oppression of women, political motivations. And then the third wave, from around about the mid-90s to maybe even just around now, and the potential beginning of a fourth wave. And from about that, it's all been about the influence of the second wave, and it includes women of different ethnicities, abilities, and disabilities, classes, appearance, sexual orientation, and gender identities. Now remember that the word rhetoric is to represent persuasive communication. So rhetorical movements are collective, pervasive efforts that try to affect change in existing attitudes, laws, and policies in society. Now, there have been multiple women's movements. The rhetorical movements about gender are not uniform and embrace a variety of ideas about gender and pursue a range of goals. Now, we're going to explore the women's movements within the two ideologies that have been informing the movement's goals. First, there's the liberal feminists that assert that women and men are similar and therefore deserve equal rights and equal in other ways. Therefore, they should have the same rights, roles, and opportunities. The second group from the liberal feminists are the cultural feminists. And unlike the liberals, they state that men and women are essentially different and consequently should have unique rights, roles, and opportunities. So we're going to start our review from the first wave and the liberal ideology. So let's get started. So firstly, how was the liberal ideology expressed? Well, the women's rights movement focused on enlarging women's political rights. Among other reforms, early feminists desired the right to vote in order to affect politics. In 1848, Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's right convention, and it was organized by Lucretia Coffin Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Mott and Stanton and others wrote a keynote address, and they called it the Declaration of Sentiments, which was modeled after the Declaration of Independence in support of women's civil liberties. The Declaration of Sentiments cataloged specific grievances women had suffered: exclusion from the right to vote and all forms of higher education, limited access to employment, the loss of property rights upon marriage. At the time, the convention had little effect on mainstream politics. Now, I'm going to have posted two short videos of this time in the week, what are we in? Week 4. Wherever week this video will be in, those videos will be there as well. Now, although some African Americans were key players early in the first wave, tensions between white and black activists did develop, and particularly over whether prioritizing women's suffrage or African American male suffrage. Over time, the women's right movement came into focus largely on issues of concern to white women, whereas black women turned their efforts towards advancing the rights of African Americans. Black men received their suffrage in 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. The right to vote could not be based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Black men won the right to vote. Women of different sexual orientation and gender expressions and identities were involved in early women's rights movements. They did not rely on men for protection and were particularly vulnerable to gender inequalities, and they were less constrained by marriage or child rearing. Women gained the right to vote in the U.S. August 26, 1920. However, in Canada, women won the right to vote in Manitoba January 28, 1916, 4 years before the Americans. Instrumental in this occurring was the work of 5 Canadian women known as the Famous Five. The women are Emily Murphy, Irene Marriott Parlby, Nellie Mooney McClune, Louise Crumby McKinney, and Henrietta Muir Edwards. And now this is where the second video that I will post will be also there in that week. Now, the cultural ideology is demonstrated in the 1800s by what is known as the cult of domesticity. A reminder though, cultural ideology believed that men and women were fundamentally different and not alike as what the liberal ideology was. So the cult of domesticity asserts that men and women were fundamentally different. Women were suited to the domestic sphere because they were more moral and nurturing than men. This concept is called the cult of domesticity. In fact, cultural feminists at this time believed that women's higher morality could help eliminate corruption associated with the political sphere if women had the right to vote. The cult of domesticity worked to end slavery, ban alcohol, and create child labor laws. After about the mid-1920s, the women's rights movement became fairly inactive for several decades for a number of reasons, most of which was including the national focus on World War I and World War II. Also, in some ways more significant was the war effort. Women entered the workforce in record numbers, and after the wars, men returned home, women were fired as men took their jobs back. Women ended up getting married, having 3 kids before they were 30. Children left home by the time that she was 50. The lack of opportunities outside the home and the family were awakened, what is known as the second wave. So the second wave of feminism was around 1963 to around the mid-90s. And it includes a number of different groups that came out of the second wave. It included the liberal feminists, cultural feminists, and anti-feminists. And we're going to start with the liberal ideology. Again, to remind you, the liberal ideology is that men and women are fundamentally alike and therefore should have equal rights and roles. And we're going to begin with the radical feminists. It was also known as, and you will have heard this term from the 1960s, the women's liberation movement. And it originated in the New Left politics, which protested the Vietnam War and radical discrimination. Many women withdrew from the New Left in protest of rampant sexism and formed their own organizations. Now, I can mention, this was during the early 60s, and protesting by young people on many issues was occurring. It was a time of change, not just in North America, but in other places around the world. Now, remember, it is the 60s, and they had what were known as consciousness-raising groups. They were also known as rap groups. And these are groups in which all members had equal opportunity to speak, became a very significant form of communication in radical feminism. This helped women understand that their individual experiences of inequality were related to a larger structures of oppression. One very important outcome of radical feminism was the identification of structural basis for women's oppression. Radical feminists recognized that how things worked in the culture had an effect on women's individual situations, giving rise to the idea that the personal, meaning me, is political. I had a role politically. One such movement encouraged women to reject sexism in healthcare and to learn about and better understand their own bodies. There was a book that came out in the 70s. I can remember it very clearly because it was a very popular book. And it was called Our Bodies, Ourselves. And it was published in 1970 to help women, to this end, understand their bodies better. Now, due to the lack of formal organization, radical feminists were not able to change the public policies and structures. However, they did provide an important critique of sexual inequality. Now, the second group, the liberal feminists, developed around the same time as the radical feminists and the advocates for women's equality in all aspects of life. Liberal feminism was sparked by the publication of Betty Friedman's book, The Feminine Mystique, and it was published in 1963, which is why it's often designated as the time of the second wave. In her book, Friedman describes what she referred to as the problem that has no name. The dissatisfaction and discontent, that is, that women experience due to their lack of opportunities outside the home. Remember, members of the, men from war were coming back and taking jobs. The jobs that women had done and done surprisingly well to help the war efforts, but now we're back home. They had kids, the kids left, and now they were what? So this lack of access was the result of structural and institutional inequalities in the United States and Canada. Now, the National Organization for Women, also known as NOW, a liberal feminist organization, was founded in 1966 and continues to work for women politically and professionally and educational equality today. While liberal feminism did emerge out of the needs of the middle class, the movement was more racially and social-economically diverse than it's often given credit for being. Liberal feminists are not confined to the United States, as liberal feminism movements have developed in response to oppression of women all over the world. There's a third group known as womanism, and it was founded by a group of black women who show how race and gender intersect at the oppression of women in color. Womanists point out that black women, in comparison to white women, are more often single, have more children, are paid less, and assume more financial responsibilities for their families. Womanists also focus on how class intersects race and gender in women's lives, working to make social services more responsive to the need of poor women and improve job training and opportunities so that more women of color can have access to well-paying jobs. In 1997, the Million Women March was a grassroots organization where marching was in support of African American women. Another group called the Multiracial Feminism. It's a fourth liberal ideological group, and it builds on the focus of equality for black women by emphasizing multiple systems of domination. In this movement, race is especially important, but it's also intertwined with other systems of oppression. Now, our last group of liberal groups is the eco-feminists, and they argue that there is a connection between women's oppression and the desire to dominate nature. Eco-feminists believe that as long as oppression is culturally valued, It will be imposed on anyone or anything that cannot or will not resist it. In this movement, all forms of oppression are linked, and feminism is about justice and ending all forms of oppression. Okay, let's move on to our second group, and we're going to move on. Okay. Now we're going to move into the cultural ideology. Now this is where the foundation is that women and men are different in important ways and should therefore have different rights and roles. The first cultural group we'll explore is separatism. Now, separatists sought to provide communities for women to live independently of men. Separatists believe that women are fundamentally different than men, and in that they value harmony, peace, life, equality, and nurturance. And since society is dominated by patriarchy and capitalism, separatists form their own communities apart from the values typically associated with Western masculinity. They have very little political influence because they choose to live outside the dominant political system. Now, alternatively, revalorism, that's our next group, is a feminist movement focusing on creating heightened public awareness and respect for women's contributions to society. The revalorists, they desire to increase the value placed on women's traditional roles and skills. From standpoint theory, the revalorists argued that women's traditional involvement in childcare, in domestic responsibilities, makes them more nurturing, supportive, and cooperative than men. As you may expect, they have been anti-feminism in the second wave. In the 1970s, Maribel Morgan launched the Total Woman movement, and Helen Andelin founded the Fascinating Womanhood movement. Now, both of these groups advocate that women's return to their traditional roles, traditional values, and attitudes. The primary support for this return to tradition came from women who were economically dependent on their husbands and who espoused conservative values. More significantly, the Stop ERA movement also developed in the 70s, and this movement emerged in response to the 1972-1973 campaign to ratify Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA. I can remember this going on in the States big time. The movement major figure was Phyllis Schlafly, who argued that feminism was destroying femininity by encouraging women to be more like men. The Stop ERA movement was successful in blocking ratification of the amendment. It has still not been passed to this day in the United States. A lot of what was occurring in the 1970s has been pushed by one party over another, and that's been a trajectory that's been a part of politics in the U.S. probably since the 1840s. Now, there is a second wave within contemporary feminism. The Riot Girl and Power Feminism are two examples. Riot Girl began as an underground movement in the 80s, founded out of the punk music and radical DIY, do-it-yourself, politics and ethics. They used music and e-zines. E-zines are electronic magazines to spread their perspective. They look like they would be instrumental in moving the second wave into a third wave. Power feminists is predicated on belief that women's passive acceptance of discrimination and identification as a victim is the reason for discrimination and oppression. Women can stop oppression by using their own power to control what happens to them and how they identify themselves and their experiences. Power feminists Naomi Wolf states that women's own belief that they are victims is what holds them back from achieving equality. Power feminism appeals to white, successful, well-educated women, tends to be less helpful for those without privilege, and emphasizes empowerment as influential in shaping the third wave. Trans feminism is a movement by and for trans and gender nonconforming people. Trans and gender nonconforming people have been active participants in women's movements from the beginning and have informed the intersectional feminism for decades. It argues that not only is gender socially constructed, society's expectations of how males and females should look, behave, and feel are arbitrary. They have three primary beliefs. First, people have the right to define and express their own identities. Secondly, people have the right to expect society to respect the identities they claim and express. And then thirdly, people have the right to bodily autonomy without fear of discrimination or violations from anyone. They believe that their liberation is directly linked to the liberation of all women. So the movement invites all people to reflect on the extent to which they have internalized gender stereotypes and heterosexist or patriarchal perspectives. Okay, mainstream third wave. Let's jump to there. Some groups of the second wave feminists are still active today. Simultaneously, a third wave of feminists have become popular. Third wave feminism is less structured than the previous waves and is very diverse, including women of various races, sexuality, classes, abilities. You're seeing that it's a much more diverse group. So let's look at the third wave feminism. So one of the key tenets of third wave feminism is intersectionality. Third wave feminists recognize that women differ in terms of race, class, sexual orientation, body shape and size, ability, disability. They seek to figure out how to speak for women as a group while still recognizing these differences. They see oppression as intersectional and that race, class, gender, sexual orientation, etc. have to be addressed holistically. The second tenet is coalitions and alliances. Third wavers form relationships with other people and groups that work against various forms of oppression. The third tenet, everyday resistance. Third wave feminists believe that the changes that the changes of the second wave feminists fought for have not been effectively integrated into daily life. They seek to promote individual changes following the structural changes that have been made. They say that politics must come from embodied positions from one's everyday life. 4, media savvy. Because of the era in which they were born, third wave feminists are immersed in media and use media to accomplish their goals. And 5th, consumerist and individualism. This is not a component for all third wavers. However, some readily embrace girl culture and emphasize being sexy and feminine, which often involves a great deal of product consumption. Focuses on individual goals, strategies, and identities are important to third wave feminism. Some say that this means the third wave will be unlikely to have widespread political success because there are no unified goals for the movement. Now, hip-hop feminism is rooted in black feminism and responsive to concerns of the post-civil rights or hip-hop generation. Distinct from other branches of third wave feminism because it's centered on the needs and the experiences of young black women and draws on hip hop as a subculture committed to challenging the status quo. Some forms of racist discrimination have been prohibited, but systematic racism persists. From their early influences on the civil rights movement of the 60s and the cultural depiction of black people in communities and media, hip-hop feminism has been tackling these emerging issues. It can be heard in many current artists who challenge misogyny, gender norms, and women's rights. All right? So that kind of wraps up our overview of the many forms of women's movement. So there you go. So is there a fourth wave is an interesting question. The first stirrings of a new stage in feminist activism were evidenced in January 21, 2017, as women across the world marched with their allies in over 650 cities. The issues of the anti-abortion, trans rights, and the role of women being argued in the U.S. Maybe the move is to be more global shift. Time will tell. We'll see you next week, everybody. Bye for now.